If you want to write music, you're going to need to know how to write rhythms at some point. Rhythm is the basis of almost all music. It's really hard to write music without some sort of rhythm. Now, if we were to define rhythm, you would probably say it's something to do with the beat or the pulse, and you're not wrong, it does, but rhythm is a little bit more than that. Rhythm is the duration and the arrangement of the notes within the framework of the beat. So it's all about how long the pitches are relative to the other pitches in the piece and also the underlying beats. The most common time signature in Western music is 4/4 time. That means we have 4 beats grouped together in what we call a measure. So a note that takes up a whole measure is what we call a whole note. It's worth 4 beats. Divide the whole note in half and you get 2 half notes. Divide that half note in half and you get 2 quarter notes. Divide it again and you get 2 eighth notes. Do you see the pattern here? The names of these notes are really just the fraction of how much of the measure they take up in 4/4 time. So if I'm talking about a quarter note in 4/4 time, a quarter note takes up 1/4 of the full measure. We could hypothetically keep going down the list, getting smaller and smaller note values and adding more flags, but at some point it becomes totally unrealistic for anyone to write or perform those rhythms. So you're going to see some note values as small as 64th notes or even 128th notes, but that's not very common. Most composers will opt for larger note values that are a lot easier to read. Speaking of uncommon note values, there is actually one note that's larger than a whole note, and that's a double whole note. It's worth the same as 2 whole notes or 8 counts total. Again, this is not common. Depending on what type of music you play, you may never actually see one of these in real life, but it does exist, and I have seen it in actual music that I've performed. Now, music is not just the sounding pitches that you play or sing, it's also the rests or the silences in between the notes. And so with rhythm, we need to be able to notate those as well. We do that with what we call rests. There's a rest version of all of the notes that I've shown you so far. We can start up here with a double whole note. A double whole note rest looks like this. It just means that we're not going to play or sing anything for 8 counts, the same duration as a double whole note. A whole note rest looks like this. A half note rest looks like this. Now these 2 rests right here look really similar, so it's easy to forget which one's which. The whole note rest hangs down from the line, kind of like a hole in the ground that you could fall into. The half rest sits on top of the line, kind of like a hat, and to me hat sounds similar to the word half, so that's how I remember it. Quarter note rests are this weird squiggly shape. If you're trying to draw a quarter note rest, I like to think of it as a Z on an angle with a C attached to the bottom. Or you can just add in a squiggle, that's okay too. An eighth rest looks kind of like a 7 with the dot on the end. And for all of the rests that are smaller than an eighth note, we just add a flag like we did on the normal notes. A 16th rest then looks just like an eighth note rest, but we're adding an extra flag right here. Can I just pause for a minute and say how amazed I am that the system actually works? I mean, if you think about it, this is a super simple system. We are taking one note and just dividing it in half, and then dividing it in half, and then dividing it in half. It's a system where everything is literally just divided in 2s. And we've been using this for like 1,000 years. It's kind of crazy to me that this even works. And when we run into things that don't quite fit into this framework, we have developed ways of adjusting our notation system. So for example, sometimes we need a pitch to last not just 2 counts or 1 count, sometimes we need 3 counts. And how do you do that when everything is just divided into 2s? Well, we have figured out a way. There's actually a couple ways. We're going to start with ties. So a tie is a curved line that connects 2 notes of the same pitch. If they're different pitches, it's a slur and that's different. But if they're the same pitch, then that curved line ties those 2 notes together and you treat it as if it were 1 note. 2 quarter notes tied together, for example, means that you'd hold this note for 2 counts. You'll often see ties over bar lines where a half note wouldn't work because it doesn't fit within the measure, because remember, each measure has to have exactly 4 counts. So if I'm trying to put a half note here at the end, that would add on an extra count that doesn't fit within that 4 count measure. So adding a tie over into the next measure is how we deal with that sort of situation. There are other reasons to use a tie within a measure, but for right now, we're going to leave it at that and talk about dots. Adding a dot to a note increases the value of that note by a half. A half note, for example, is worth 2 counts. So if I add a dot to it, I'm adding half of that. So 1 extra count. So a dotted half note is worth 3 counts total. A dotted quarter note, on the other hand, would not be worth 2 counts because that dot isn't adding another count, it's adding a half count. Remember, the quarter note by itself is worth 1 full count, so if I add a dot to that, that's going to add half of the full count, so you're going to end up with 1.5 counts. Now, if I do this with an eighth note, a dotted eighth note is only worth 3/4 of a count because we have half of the count to begin with, and now we're adding a 16th note. And have you ever seen a double dot? That's right, we can add more than one dot to a note. Each dot adds half of whatever comes before it. So the second dot adds half of the dot before it, not the note. So if I double dot a half note, the first dot adds half of the half note, or 1 count, but the second dot adds half of 1 count, so a double dotted half note is actually worth 3.5 counts, not 4 counts. It's not the same as a whole note. Another way that we can adjust our rhythm notation system to accommodate other rhythms, more interesting rhythms, is to use tuplets. When we use a tuplet, what we're saying is, hey, I know that the normal rhythm system would have us put 2 notes here, but I don't want to do that. I want to fit in a different number. So instead of 2, maybe I want to squish in 3 notes into that same amount of time, or 5 notes, or 9 notes, or 11 notes. And I'm just saying, hey, I know this doesn't really fit into our rhythm system as it normally is, but for right now, we're going to do this. The most common tuplets are triplets. So with basic rhythmic notation, everything is divisible by 2s. So when we want a group of 3 somewhere, we have to use a triplet. If I want to squeeze in 3 notes into the space of 1 beat, for example, I would just take the note value that would normally fill that beat, in this case, eighth notes, and then put 3 of them and stick a triplet sign on them. It doesn't have to be a group of 3 though. I could do a group of 5, I could do a group of 7, or even 11. It doesn't really matter how many I'm putting into this beat. I just have to make sure that the note values all add up so that I have the right number of beats total in the measure. You can also have tuplets that span multiple beats within a measure. The most common example of this are quarter note triplets. Normally, 2 quarter notes fit into half of a measure, but with quarter note triplets, we're now putting 3 evenly spaced quarter notes into that same amount of time. Now those can get a little bit tricky to count, but if you think of it as the same concept as just a normal triplet within 1 count, it's just now we're spreading it out a little bit more, then it's actually not so bad. With all of these different ways of notating rhythms, things can get a little confusing for the performer, especially if a composer is trying to do something really crazy. So it's our job as a composer or a performer to write everything as cleanly and clearly as we possibly can. My next video right over here will explain how to do all of that.